By now, Searle had regular commissions for a number of publications, not least as the resident theatrical illustrator at Punch. But it was an altogether less elevated strand of his output that was finding favour with the British public.
It's certainly the most influential period of his work, as far as I'm concerned. It was the sort of deliciously wicked subversiveness of the St. Trinian's cartoons, and of course I was a school child and related very easily to the antics, or at least to the aspirations, as it were, to be as naughty as these children. There's a wickedness to it, and even a touch of evil, but Searle manages to prevent it from going too far.
For me, St. Trinian's were like wonderful. It was like liberating. I thought, oh yes, no more puff-sleeve dresses, and none of this kind of being tidy and going to the church fete and holding a tray of flowers and posies and selling these, which I did for charity, but I mean really at home in my dungarees. So for me, St. Trinian's were entirely natural, and I regard them now. I thought later, he was such an innovator. He saw something in women which wasn't colluding with an English sense of taste and propriety, which chained women, actually. He had the wit and the sort of humanity to see a darker side and actually allow that to come through and enjoy it.
I think they're good gags. I think they're about the incipient savage wickedness of children who will revert to a savage state if left unattended. He's the graphic equivalent of Lord of the Flies. I think it tells you very little about Britain. It tells you a lot about how wicked children can be.
It found an immediate reaction because it was perhaps the first time in the history of cartooning that someone had simply stated that children could be cruel, disgusting, inconceivably un-19th century childlike.
I see the cruelty in Searle as coming from his experience in the prison camp. It seems to me an amazing human achievement, and I can't think of another parallel of someone who has been through an ordeal like that, an ordeal which he barely survived, which everyone now thinks of as the great atrocity of the Second World War on the military side, to turn it into funny goings-on at a girls' school. You can see the visual pickups quite easily, things that he drew in the camps and things that he imagines in St. Trinian's. But to turn it into something that's genial, attractive, makes people laugh. When you have suffered that much, I really can't think of another artistic parallel.
The publication of Hurrah for St. Trinian's, the first of the series in 1948, was the cue for the entire nation to go schoolgirl mad.
Inevitably, huge pressure was put on him to amalgamate the drawings, to consolidate them as books. They led, of course, to movies. That is an extraordinary thing. I don't think people realise. I mean, now I think about it, I realise he probably is the only illustrator in the entire history of illustration. It's actually given rise to a culture, a complete universe, resolved in cinematic terms.
In St. Trinian's, Searle had unwittingly spawned a commercial monster. With the books selling in their thousands, he and Kay Webb headed for Paris on a working holiday, the end result of which was published as Paris Sketchbook.
He went round Paris with his wife. She wrote, and she tried to keep off people interfering with him while he drew. And he described, really, the atmosphere of post-war Paris in these marvellous drawings which made up the book.
That sort of thing is very evocative. You can sort of feel you're there. You can feel in every line that he's actually on the spot. He's not making it up from his imagination.
After their success in Paris, Searle and Webb turned to London with a series of London characters for the News Chronicle. It was eventually published in book form as Looking at London.
An examination of human nature is what he's doing, and he's doing it through this extraordinary line which looks so definite and has such rhythm and is so pleasing, and yet if you look at it very closely, it's hesitant, it's full of doubts, it's shaky almost. It's very, very hard to reproduce.
All I know about the way he works is his line. That's what shines through. And that's always in cartooning, that's the most important part of it. And you look closely at it, which not many people do, but you look close, you just look at the jagginess, you look at the inkiness, you look at the sort of the splatteriness, the way he uses it, and the way it's sort of applied. It's alive. That's the thing that defines it first. It leaps off the page and grabs you by the eyeballs.
It's melodious, I would say, because it goes from thick to thin and then back again. He's very interested in the line, and I think he's got many, many nibs and different types of equipment, so that he is always varying the line.
What do people actually mean when they talk about Searle's line? Well, here is Hogarth's line of beauty. Beautiful, flowing line. Well, pretty flowing anyway. And this is Searle's line, which is far more jagged. Presses down on the pen, different levels in different ways. What it shows is a fight between the pen and the paper, as if there's a sort of conflict going on, which marks the whole thing as something different from straightforward art. But more typical than the line of beauty is, of course, Searle's angles. For some reason or other, these always seem to be about 37 degrees. It could be somebody's elbow jutting into somebody else's side, or more frequently, it's just a nose. And then around that nose, you can create anything you like. You can have the eyes, and then you hood the eyes, or you put bags under the eyes, and you fit in the nostril. And in an amazing economy of line, you manage to capture a whole series of facial expressions.
It's a line that goes for a walk, and I would imagine, perhaps unexpected even to Ronald Searle, but he would have an idea in his head what it might look like. But I think the pen is like his handwriting, and off it goes, and then he sort of tickles it. It is a kind of, and then he emphasizes bits with this. The noises he must make with his pen as he's drawing must be completely wonderful.
There's a wonderful drawing just called Lines, and it shows a fist grasping a bunch of lines like lightning rods. And from these lines are sort of almost literally electrifying compositions which fill the whole sheet, and all the familiar Searle grotesques, the cats and the smirking nudes, Don Quixote figures on horseback, pigs. But it is wonderfully expressive of this kind of explosion of linear energy and imagination.
The early 1950s finally saw Britain shake off her post-war austerity. It was a good time to be involved in the graphic arts, and Searle's work rate continued unabated. He began to find new outlets across the Atlantic, and even set up his own publishing company. Meantime, to his increasing chagrin, Britain was in the grip of St. Trinian's fever.
Well, St. Trinian's, I suppose, it was our equivalent of a kind of Disney. It was as big as that, because as soon as it went into the film world, it certainly was. and accompanied by the kind of advertising events that bordered on civil disturbance.
A reign of terror is about to start in the heart of London. Armed to their protruding teeth with hand-propelled hockey sticks and their old battle-axe of a French mistress, a fifth column of sixth formers are stealthily stealing out of St. Trinian's to attempt a coup d'etat. Their French teacher insisted on taking part in the coup to see they got their accent right. The enemy is soon wiped out. Police are called to control the crowds, and General Gingle is acclaimed dictator of St. Trinian's.
He felt, after the exhilaration of an incident like that, which was certainly attention-getting, that this was not quite the thing that he wanted to be associated with. And so there was no more of that. But at the time, this was huge. And still, as you see, I mean, people run St. Trinian's parties now. People turn up in gym slips and so on. I don't know what it is about the taste of the British that Ronald set off, but he certainly wished it hadn't gone as far as it did.
What people don't remember is that there were so few drawings. It really was only a small part of my work. It was by accident a series. In the 4 or 5 years, and it was only 4 or 5 years that they ran, there were no more than about 60 drawings probably, and to me it was a series of drawings, but of no particular consequence.
Typecast, as an actor will, and he became, the St. Trinian's man. He was very, very depressed by that. And Britain does that to people. It compartmentalizes you, it tries to domesticate you and tame you, and it takes the danger out of what you do.
The suffocation of success with them left him no scope. His time was limited. He wanted to do different kinds of commissions. He was getting work from America and magazines that meant reportage trips, however onerous and tiring, very exciting and taxing. And so he prepared to travel all over the world, and he didn't want to take these awkward schoolgirls with him. And he didn't need them in the baggage. He'd done that.
In 1953, Searle joined in the St. Trinian's hype one last time. Dressed as an undertaker, he launched the last book, Souls in Torment, in which the school is hit by an atomic bomb, sounding what he hoped would be its death knell.
I look on it that I was a cook who was fairly competent in the kitchen and could perhaps achieve 1 or 2 marvelous sauces. One might even go into the classic cookery book. But on the side, I produced a jam tart, which everyone adored. This was the most popular jam tart that the English public had ever eaten. I had enough of this jam tart about 1952, and I thought, marvelous, this is at its height, I'll destroy it all, and it will disappear from my life.
With St. Trinian's dead, Searle's publisher was keen to follow its success with a new bestseller. To this end, he collaborated with Punch writer Geoffrey Willans, and his next big hit was born in the form of the monstrous schoolboy Molesworth.
It's very rare for cartoonists to be able to work well with writers, because the object of a writer is to create a picture in the head. Searle and Willans work wonderfully together. There is never any sense that Molesworth, or any of the characters in that book, are different coming out of the paragraph than they are coming off the page. It's this symbiotic relationship.
For a child, they were so funny. I would laugh at the school dog and the ways teachers would torture pupils. It just seemed not exactly my experience, because I didn't go to St. Custard's, but I did go to a boarding school where there were punishments. Also, he can literally draw anything. He can draw boats and skyscrapers and aeroplanes and terribly fat pigs.
The installation of Malcolm Muggeridge as editor of Punch led to a series of special commissions for the magazine, the first of which was a modern take on William Hogarth's masterpiece, The Rake's Progress.
The Rake's Progress is a series of characters, the different types of rake, and you get the complete life of the rake from birth to death. And there's just a wonderfully complete picture of the sort of pretensions of British life of that period.
I probably saw it when I was a kid, but I didn't really understand it. Seeing it in later life, you just see his sheer skill. It's got a sort of lightness about it, a lightness of touch, but an absolute penetrating sort of skewering savagery as well.
Of course, the whole of Searle's style reaches a kind of apotheosis in his treatment of legs and the feet below them. And in Searle's case, legs and feet are almost windows to the soul, whether it's the kind of spindly spider's legs coming out of the top-heavy bulk of the St. Trinian's girls, or later on these enormous, thick, tree trunk-like elephant legs, which always end in these beautiful shoes, or beautiful feet, which again have that angle at about 37 degrees, which is a sort of benchmark of Searle's style. And these shoes clump all the way through his career, and they're strangely magnificent, but also nobody else could do them quite like Ronald Searle.
That man must have been so restless in the 50s, because it must have been just pouring out of him and down the scratchy nib onto the page. I suppose that's a level of graphic production and humour that I don't think I've seen bettered in post-war Britain.
In 1956, Searle negotiated an extremely lucrative contract with Punch magazine, making him theirs exclusively, an unheard-of arrangement at the time.
Punch occupied itself with a social area about which I knew nothing, but it took the piss out of it at the same time. It targeted a readership that laughed because it recognised the social milieu that was having the piss taken out of it, but didn't think it was part of it. So middle-aged ladies in floral hats at Ascot, or men playing golf, saw these, jolly funny, that really is. But it was them. And Searle was part of that. I mean, when Searle was doing his women, extraordinary, he was much more satirical than the other Punch people.
His Punch contract allowed him to work for European and American publications, a loophole of which he took full advantage. In 1957, he made his first trip across the Atlantic to the America of Eisenhower and Elvis.
Ronald did some wonderful work, which is not known about at all here, really, for American magazines in the 60s. Holiday magazine and that sort of thing. And they were to do with... There was a great... We remember, from the time, there was a great outpouring of Americans all over the globe in their uniform of, Bermuda shorts and sunglasses and baseball caps and huge cameras. And I think some of the loveliest things he did were just really views of towns and in the sunshine, beautiful colours too.
They did Texas and they did Arkansas, and he did these wonderful cowgirls, these amazing drunks, the great prairies, the John Ford, Utah, Monument Valley. He did it all, and it's extraordinary.
Although Searle continued to work for Punch, his work abroad was affording him much more freedom, and he began to spend less and less time at home.
He began to work in the New Yorker, and he worked in Europe, and they rewarded him more, not only monetarily, but with the reception that he got. He became a huge star in America and a huge star in Europe. And very few of our homebred artists do that.
He had celebrity, he had done that, he had finished that phase of his career, and he wanted to try something new. And I think, being so visually acute, also wanted to try new sights, new light, which artists do want. I think he'd done England.
Searle's departure from these shores was dramatic. In 1961, without a word of warning, he left home, ending his relationship not just with Punch magazine, his only regular source of income, but also with his wife Kay Webb. Choosing Europe over America as his new home, he headed for Paris, where he would stay for the next 15 years. Perhaps the hardest part of his decision was leaving his children Kate and John behind.
He left a note on the kitchen table, and, you know, saying goodbye, I've gone. And Kay and the children were away at the time. They came back to find this, a complete bewilderment to them, and probably a shock to him when he thought back on what he'd done. But that was the only way he could do it and make sure that he did go.
Well, any decision is difficult to make, but when it becomes a major decision, like whether you change your life totally, it demands a complete reassessment of life. The difficulty is to have enough clarity, perhaps, to see the problem in a detached way, and to have enough clarity to see whether what you want to do, whether it's important enough to destroy something and rebuild.
It was a big decision to go because he had nobody to work for. He certainly had no outlets on the continent, and yet he felt he would be regarded there as an artist with something to offer, with explorations to make, not with a furrow to plough as he'd been in up to that point. Or he felt he was becoming that kind of a, you know, people would know what to expect of him here. He didn't really know what to expect of himself there.
It wasn't long before Searle found his feet in Paris. In a culture that had a long and honourable tradition of graphic satire, he was finally regarded as a true artist.
The night was mighty dark, so you could hardly see.
I can look at England now almost as a visitor, certainly as an outsider, as I do with other countries. In a way, I've isolated myself, but it's given me time to think and explore, and to absorb the atmosphere in countries other than my own.
On an earlier visit to Paris, Searle had befriended Monica Sterling, the woman who would later become his second wife. It was to her he turned when he arrived there in 1961. They very quickly became soulmates, and as the commissions rolled in from every corner of the globe, travelled the world together.
The French seemed to take him to their hearts in the 60s in a slightly mysterious way. I'm not quite sure how it happened, because the amount of work that they were seeing nationally was fairly limited, but his reputation built very quickly. I think that the secret was that they took on the reputation he already had from this country, but took it seriously, which we notoriously don't. We just want funny stuff from artists. But they saw him as an artist with a capital A, and he was able to put out books with titles like Anatomies and Decapitations. Now, you never have got away with that in Britain, because that sounds pompous, but that kind of abstraction is fine for the French audience and very well calculated for them, actually. So by 1972, he'd only been there a decade, he had a personal retrospective at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Now, that's a huge thing to happen in Paris, because they take those institutions very, very seriously. And that's almost like winning an Oscar in America.
These are the French. They hate the British. They hate the idea that the British can actually be good at art, because art is what Frenchmen do. Searle is I think, the only living foreign artist ever to have a retrospective at the Bibliothèque Nationale.
The French taste suited Searle's aspirations and liberated his drawing style. He remained in Paris until 1975, when Monica became ill with cancer. Since then, the Searles had lived quietly in a tiny village high in the mountains of Provence. Proof that the French had accepted him as one of their own came when he was invited to contribute to Le Monde, one of Europe's most respected daily newspapers, on a regular basis.
Searle's drawing is remarkable in that I think for a man reaching his later years to have begun again on a new project for Le Monde, which must have invigorated him a great deal, I think, and produce such wonderful drawings, which is so cleverly conceptualized, is an extraordinary achievement. Very important artists constantly renew themselves, and he did. So the quality of the drawings in the Le Monde are marvellous, and the conceptual insights and ideas that reflect the political awareness and social awareness are extraordinary. I don't think there's nobody coming up behind who could do that.
It was a great shame, probably for the status of cartoon, because he's our greatest cartoonist, I think, by a mile. I think if he'd stayed around, you know, it'd be in much better shape. Simply because he's such a powerful figure.
As far as I'm concerned, one of the great pleasures of living in France is that we can get our bottles of champagne straight from the supplier, and that the day is over and the glass of champagne is bubbling, and off we go into the next day. You know, there's still a pleasure to be had out of clinking the odd glass here and there. If all your generation, everyone you knew, died when they were 19 and 20, you've got the biggest present in the world. You live from day to day thinking, my God, you know, I should have died when I was 19 and I'm 85 now. And I'm obviously making, for me, I'm making the best I can of every second I have of my life.
He's influenced the best. All the great illustrators, cartoonists, all know him and all have him at the back of their mind.
What does Ronald Searle mean to me, or what image do I have when I think of him? I usually think of one of his characters, and probably one of his characters who've got this kind of glorious pessimism. Something awful is going to happen, but perhaps it won't, or perhaps it will be less, or perhaps it will be worse than he thinks. So that's what I think.
How does he see himself? How does he see his own status, sort of thing? Because he is like a god, you know, he really is. But all I do see him is I see his stature.
He's seen the worst of the world and worse things than you or I will ever see. And that's always in the background. You know it's lurking there. And I hope he sleeps well. I have no evidence that he doesn't. By now, he certainly deserves to.
I see trees of green.
The Wildlife of Gerald Darrell tomorrow night with BBC 4 on BBC 2 at the same time, 11:20.
For me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Ooh, yeah.
Tomorrow on 2.